And good evening. I was just giving it a minute there to make sure that we were on YouTube live. And before we go any further, if you would, please subscribe to my channel. Click on the subscribe bar right there when it pops up. There's a notification bell. Just click on it. You'll be notified anytime I add content to the channel. Like these videos, give it a thumbs up if you like it, comment on these videos, share these videos. Now let's get on with it. I'm going to try and go live on Saturdays, or at least prepare a video on Saturdays with the idea of helping you prepare for Sunday. The Sunday's coming. Are you prepared? Now, for those of you who worship with a church anytime on Sundays, I'm doing this for you because I've been thinking a lot about how not just ministers and song leaders and people like that need to prepare, but really anyone who's assembling with Christians needs to prepare, because it is an important meeting. When we get together with God's people, it is something that's important. And when we prepare for or have important events coming up, we need to prepare for them. If you're taking a test in school, typically you need to prepare. I wasn't that good at math, so when I got into algebra and that kind of thing, I had to study for it and prepare. If you have a business meeting, say you're a salesman, and you've got a really big sales presentation coming up this week, you got to prepare for it. Getting your statistics and your sales figures and whatever you need lined up and ready to go. Now, to adequately worship God, we need to take the time to prepare. This is, after all, the most important event, meeting, whatever you wish to call it, that we have. We're meeting with God's people to worship the creator of the universe. And the lack of preparation in our worship is evident many times when we look around at morning worship services. And I hear people over the years, I've been a Christian now since the mid-1980s, and I've heard people over the years say things like, well, I just don't get anything out of worship. And a normal reply to that is, we're humans, you're not meant to get anything out of it, or you're just thinking of yourself. But I want us to look at a couple of things in this lesson today. This is going to be a short one. These will be short studies, just meant to be about 10 minutes or so, or 15 minutes. And I want us to consider some things. Now, I will concede the point that God is meant to get something out of our worship. You see here in Psalm 100, make a joyful shout, or the old King James says, make a joyful noise to the Lord, all you lands. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before his presence with singing. Know that the Lord, he is God. It is he who has made us and not we ourselves. We are his people and the sheep of his pasture. Enter into his gates, watch this, with thanksgiving, and into his courts with praise. Be thankful to him and bless his name. For the Lord is good, his mercy is everlasting, his truth endures forever. Now notice we are to give God thanksgiving. Enter in with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. So yes, he is meant to get something out of our worship. Leviticus chapter 7, God there says, besides the cakes as his offering, he shall offer leavened bread with the sacrifice of thanksgiving of his peace offering. So God is to receive thanksgiving from us, as we see from these instructions. And Paul encouraged Christians to continue earnestly in prayer, be vigilant in it with thanksgiving. So there are some of these things God is meant to get. But what about those of us sitting in the pews? The people who come in tomorrow, and probably, if you still do a paper bulletin, pick up a bulletin and go in and they sit down. What about them? Are they just spectators there, meant to listen to the preacher, and then on their way out just say, hey, preacher, good sermon, shake his hand, pat him on the back, and go on till next week? Well, let's look at this, because contrary to popular opinion, I think the worshiper sitting in the audience is meant to get something out of worship. For instance, I want to consider some of these scriptures, these admonitions that Paul had. Number one, look at Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Notice, teach and admonish. There should be teaching going on and admonishment. I should learn something when I come to worship. And then look at 2 Timothy 4. He says, verse 1, I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearance, and kingdom. Preach the word. Be ready. Watch this, in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and teaching. When it is in season and out of season. In other words, when it's convenient, when it's not. There'll be times when you've got to get up and preach. It's not going to be convenient because what you have to say is going to step on toes. Or maybe you've got to give a defense of the faith somewhere away from the church building, and it might not be a particularly comfortable or convenient time. But notice he says, convince, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering. We'll have more to say about what all that means a little bit later. But in Colossians chapter 3, the word of Christ is the message that is proclaimed by Christ. Let it richly dwell in you with all wisdom. And the gospel has got to dwell in the church. It's got to dwell in the individual. It's got to be something that we use, that we apply. It's meant to be practical. It's not meant just to be some book that we look at and it's way up here, but we're way down here in intelligence or anything like that. It is meant for the common man to understand. Now look back at 2 Timothy. Notice what Timothy is to do. He is to correct or convince. Those who are in error need to be told that they're in error patiently. Now, there's a lot of ways you can tell somebody with an error. You can just get in their face and say, you're a screw up. What do you think you're doing? Or you can sit down with them and say, hey, let's talk. I'm really concerned about this or that. And then they need to be rebuked. If they're sinning, explain what their sin is. Don't just go to someone, you're sinning, you're messing up, and just walk away. Well, what's my sin? Well, here it is. Just read your Bible. If you can't tell them what the sin is, then you really need to keep your mouth shut and not push it. And we need to be patient when we do this. He says to do it with all long. I missed one. I missed exhort or encourage. Those who are doing good, those who are growing, encourage them. Now, when I get up and preach a sermon, it's possible all three of those could happen in the same sermon. You might feel corrected or convinced about some sin or error in your life. Well, the guy sitting in the pew next to you might feel rebuked. Oh, yeah, I am sinning. I do need to make some changes. Meanwhile, somebody else sitting there, I'm encouraged. He talked about prayer, and I've been doing a lot of praying and studying about prayer, and he really helped me to encourage me to be more in prayer. Whereas someone else rebuked, oh man, I'm not praying enough. And someone corrected, maybe they had some misunderstanding about prayer or what prayer is. And then Timothy goes on to do it in patience. You don't just smack somebody upside the head to Sunday morning and say, you need to pray more, you need to do this, do that, and then expect them to get it right away. It might take a while. There are concepts that I've studied for months, even years, before I got a handle on them. And there are some people that just are going to need more time to study. I've dealt with the situation pretty recently where someone thought that I should have caught on immediately to what they were doing and what they were trying to teach, and I didn't. I had to ask some questions, and that's what started some issues. That's another story for another time. But these are things worshipers need to get out of worship, out of a sermon, out of a church assembly. They need to be convinced, rebuked, exhorted. They need teaching. They need admonition. Now, why is it so many times worshipers don't get anything out of worship? There's quite a few answers to that. Some have to do with the worshiper himself. Some have to do with the preachers, the song leaders, the people who are supposed to be organizing the worship assembly. Now, here's some typical answers that are offered to the problem when a worshiper or someone says, I don't get anything out of church, or I don't get anything out of worship. Some of these typical answers are, you only get out of it what you put into it. There's some truth to that. I can't just roll out of bed if let's say preaching is at 10. I can't just roll out of bed at 9 o'clock, grab a cup of coffee, throw on a shirt and some pants, and run down to the church building. I need to get up and do a little planning, give myself plenty of time to read my Bible, get the family up, whatever needs to be done. You are not meant to get anything out of it is another excuse that I have heard and that I've told people too. Well, I think we've pretty well refuted that with Colossians and with 2 Timothy 4. Only God is meant to get something out of worship. As we saw, God is meant to get our thanksgiving and our praise, and we'll dig into that a little bit more later in a future session. But as I also said, God is not the only one. The worshiper is meant to. And then people wanting to get anything out of worship are selfish. Not true. Well, usually not true. There are some people that genuinely want to learn, but there's for whatever reason they're not getting anything. It could be the preacher is preaching over their heads, or maybe he's preaching under them, that he's playing down to the audience and not really challenging them. And we'll talk about those in a future video. And then people wanting to get anything out of worship only want entertainment. Now, I'm going to have a lot to say about worship versus entertainment. But for right now, I just want to say that not everybody who has this issue is just wanting to be entertained. There are some churches, sure, you walk in, you can't tell if you're at a rock concert or if you're at a church assembly. But these are just a sample of answers that I've heard over the years, and yes, I've given them in my younger, naive days. And there is an element of truth in all of them, as we saw. But I think oftentimes they are used as an excuse. Preachers who wait till the last minute to prepare a sermon, song leaders who wait till right after Sunday school to pick songs, elders who are just men with titles who aren't really paying attention to the shepherding of the flock. We're going to consider two angles in this series. One is from the audience. What do use is those who are sitting in the audience, and I have sat in the audience many times and listened to many sermons. I always try to remember that when I'm preparing a sermon, that I've been out there. I have sat through sermons that were milk toast when I was really wanting and needing steak. And I've sat through some that could have been steak, but they were really tough. Another way to look at it, I've sat through a lot of sermons that were C's and D's, if you look at it in terms of grades, that could have been A's and B's, but for various reasons weren't. And then I'm going to look at leaders in worship. What do preachers need to do? Song leaders, prayer leaders, and anybody else who's got anything to do with the worship. What do they need to do? That's going to do it for this particular video. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click on the subscribe bar and click on the notification bell when it pops up, and comment on these videos. Give it a thumbs up if you like it. Share these videos. I can't grow the channel without the help of my loyal viewers such as yourself. Well, that's it for this Saturday night session. We'll see you next week. Have a good week and have a blessed Sunday tomorrow.